Hello and welcome to Over to You from the BBC World Service. I'm Qasa Alom. This month, countries have gathered in Belém in Brazil for the 30th annual UN Conference on Climate Change.
And that is the sound of thousands of protesters on the streets of Belém as the UN's climate conference COP30 takes place there, reaching the halfway stage now. Some of the protesters included indigenous Brazilian...
For the BBC World Service, it has meant a sustained spotlight on climate stories. One that follows a succession of major news stories about natural disasters, where climate change may have played a role.
Typhoon Fung Wong forced more than 1 million people to evacuate their homes and caused extensive flooding. 27 people are known to have died.
But what do you think about how the BBC covers what is one of the existential issues of our time?
I don't think there can be too much coverage of climate change on the World Service, given the state of the world at the moment.
I like the impartiality and thoroughness of BBC's coverage.
I feel it has only presence when something urgent or relevant occurs.
This month on Over to You, we'll be diving deep into your questions about how the BBC covers the climate, from its place in news programming.
It's finding the right balance between informing people of what clearly is a really important issue for the world, but also taking into account audiences' other interests.
The challenges of getting people engaged with the subject.
Anything that is a bit moving towards scaring people about the climate is a bad idea, you know.
And why it's important to search for solutions.
I think if you listen to the news, you might come away a little bit depressed, but in fact, the reality is there's loads of people doing fantastic work.
But before we tackle saving the planet, for the last 2 weeks, the BBC itself has been in the spotlight. A leaked memo alleging widespread bias at the corporation created massive news headlines. Among other things, the memo pointed to an edition of the TV investigative series Panorama about Donald Trump, broadcast before the US election last year. It accused the programme of having a distinctly anti-Trump stance and said it had misleadingly edited part of one of his speeches.
The controversy has not only raised questions about how the BBC should be governed, but also reignited the debate about the future of the corporation. And to understand why it's...
The BBC has now apologised for that edit, but in the furore, 2 major BBC figures have resigned. Deborah Turness, the CEO of BBC News, and the big boss himself, Director General Tim Davie.
BBC Director General Tim Davie and CEO of BBC News Deborah Turness have resigned.
I stepped down over the weekend because the buck stops with me. But I'd like to make one thing very clear. BBC News is not institutionally biased.
It has sparked intense debate over impartiality and the future of the BBC itself. And it has lit up the Over to You inbox.
Paul Taylor. I hope that the BBC gets over its current travails. The Panorama team were foolish to edit the Trump speech and deserve criticism. I rely on the BBC for unbiased, objective reporting and trust it to a degree that I do not trust other news sources. Don't lose that trust, particularly in trying to compete for ratings.
And I want to know what you think too, because I'll be putting your questions on this issue to the BBC in next month's Over to You. You can get in touch by emailing overtoyou@bbc.co.uk or leaving us a message on +44 1449 609 000. Now, climate change is often an awkward fit for the news agenda. It's an important story, but also slow and often technical and scientific. So what do you think about how the BBC World Service is doing?
This is Alison from Ghana. I don't think there can be too much coverage of climate change on the World Service, given the state of the world at the moment, and the fact that there are still leaders who continue to deny its existence. It is essential that the topic remains central to news broadcast too, and isn't shoved to the back once a COP conference is over. Journalists need to find interesting ways to present how the issue of climate change is affecting communities to prevent climate fatigue from creeping in.
Hi, my name is René De Paulo, speaking from São Paulo, Brazil. I like the impartiality and thoroughness of BBC's coverage of the COP30, but being a local, I can tell that some of the things being said cannot be taken face value, and maybe a little more digging into the recent past could actually help listeners worldwide to judge for themselves if those beautiful words, those beautiful speeches are heartfelt or simply empty words. Leaders can be charismatic, but they can also be very deceptive, and they count on our lack of collective memory.
Hi, I'm Juan Carlos in Havana, Cuba. I think the BBC has moved climate change from science programs to main news bulletins, but I feel it has only presence when something urgent or relevant occurs. About programs aimed at the climate issues, I consider there is a good balance with solution-based shows covering the stories, linking the science, the impacts, the politics, and the solutions with a really more realistic and optimistic way. I think climate issues are not prioritized sufficiently, even when there has been undeniable progress in the volume and quality of coverage during major events.
Paul Evans. Global warming is certain and is going way past 1.5 degrees centigrade. The BBC World Service is jammed full of climate programmes and reports, yet it makes no difference and doesn't change anything.
Well, joining me now is Angus Foster, the BBC News Climate and Science Team lead. Thank you for your time, Angus. So tell us, how did you plan your COP30 coverage to deliver stories that both feel impactful and relevant to the BBC audience?
So this COP30 is a slightly different one. Interest in COPs has declined a bit. I think this year's also affected by some governments are not as ambitious about change as they were a few years ago. And so I think some audiences are probably thinking, well, the chance of meaningful change coming out of this COP are a bit reduced. So we did scale back a bit, not quite as big a deployment as previous years, but the COP is a really important process. It's the sort of centre of global climate negotiations, so it's really important for the BBC to be there. We've been doing reporting from the conference and the wider community, so we've had teams up in the Amazon looking at deforestation as well.
Really interesting to hear how the priority of climate change and COP has gone down pecking order, both for certain countries, but also the appetite perhaps with the audience as well. Where do you believe climate change should sit on your news and science priority list?
I think it has gone down a bit, but it's still very much a priority for the BBC. You know, we have a dedicated climate and science team, and they're paid to do their job. I suppose the job is to sort of find out the right balance. As audiences are concerned about different issues. Certainly here in Europe, cost of living has become a big story. Some audiences are saying all these new technologies being asked to think about too expensive, whether it's electric cars, air source heat pumps, whatever they are. So it's finding the right balance between informing people of what clearly is a really important issue for the world, but also taking into account audiences' other interests.
And with that in mind, do you aim to try and make stories relevant that are from the climate and science space to the audience, or simply reflect what they are interested in?
No, they have to be relevant. So we're constantly trying to find ways to explain climate stories in ways that people can relate to and find both interesting and informative. That has to be the starting point.
And given the challenge of climate fatigue and a crowded news cycle, how do you keep climate stories a high priority, something in the forefront of people's minds, without overwhelming them?
For a start, there are certain times when people are naturally drawn towards climate stories. Those sometimes it can be related to extreme weather events, or when it suddenly becomes very obvious why people are talking about climate change. I think there are other ways, that more uplifting ways. So some of the changes to the world's economies and systems of electricity, for example, the way that solar power is becoming so much more important. So there are uplifting ways too, which a lot of audiences need that. They do get overwhelmed by too much negativity.
Is there a danger, though, in almost sugarcoating the pill, sweetening it a little bit by simply trying to find the light or the positive, when sometimes people do need to know or need to be aware that actually there is going to be changes if the temperature of the planet breaks through 1.5 or 2 degrees or even 3 degrees or 4 degrees, as scientists are forewarning for the future?
That message definitely has to get through. Sugarcoating is often levelled at us. I think the counter-argument is that unless you keep audiences interested in the subject by giving them a range of ways of looking at it, both optimistic and pessimistic, they tend just to switch off and go elsewhere. We've got quite a lot of audience data about, especially young people, finding too much negative reporting about climate change just makes them switch off and leave, just not engage with the subject. It's finding the right balance between getting the message across that this is a very serious problem which we're struggling to deal with, but it's not overwhelming because there are ways that we are making a difference. The world is starting to deal with some of these problems.
And you mentioned it a little bit earlier. I wanted to focus a moment on those major weather moments and events, for example, Hurricane Melissa or the flooding in Pakistan. In isolated situations, they themselves are disasters and issues that deserve attention. However, at the same time, is there another point to be made to link them to they are perhaps man-made issues as a result of climate change or what humans and human activity is doing? Is there a danger there in trying to connect the two, or is that something that you have to have editorial responsibility to try and put those out there as well?
So they need to be seen in the wider context. So with things like hurricanes, scientists are fairly sure that climate change is not making hurricanes more likely or more common, but is having effects. One group of scientists after Melissa, for example, said climate change increased the rainfall of Melissa by up to 16%. You can say something like that. Other things, droughts especially, are much more difficult to link directly to climate change. But I think the context within each is the world is changing, so we need to be alert to the strains that extreme weather or changing climate is putting on our countries and on the infrastructures we all rely on.
I just want to raise a comment that we've had from one of our listeners.
Nicholas Arndt. In general, I think that the BBC's coverage of climate issues has been very good, wide-ranging and relatively sober. Given the gravity of the problem, I would be tempted to be more strident, but realise that this is likely to have only a negative effect, just getting the backs up of climate sceptics.
Angus, I just want to focus on that last thought there about climate sceptics. Is it the BBC's job to convince them to change opinion, or...?
No, it's not the BBC's job to try and persuade them that something they believe in is wrong. We are simply presenting the science behind climate change is incontrovertible. We are starting from that point, but where it gets more contested is in how you deal with the implications. So there are not that many climate deniers left. There's a lot of climate skeptics who are saying, well, that's not the right way to deal with the climate. That's not the right way to make sure your emissions don't rise so quickly or whatever. So that's where the debate is. When it comes to how we tackle the issue, governments and policies or trying to sort of come to terms with it, that's where we absolutely need to remain totally impartial and not seem to be in favour of any one policy or solution.
And looking beyond the news itself, I'd love to know what sort of sustainability measures that you are implementing within your own newsroom to keep your carbon footprint minimal, but still bring these stories to the BBC audience as well. You mentioned that there was a smaller team going to COP. Are there ever conversations about, well, do we need to actually send to these events, or how many people we send, given that is also having an impact?
Yeah, no, those are very, very valid questions, and we do ask ourselves each time how we are justifying going to these conferences. I think this one is justified. We also have policies in place to make sure we don't travel by air within the UK or short-term within Europe. It's difficult within news to be as rigorous about sustainability as some other places because news happens. You need to get there quickly. Otherwise, you sort of miss it. But to the extent possible, we do have other sustainability practices in place. We're trying to do more interviews online or via video platforms as opposed to in person, for example. That can reduce our carbon footprint quite a bit. So these are things we take very seriously and we spend a lot of time thinking about.
One of the most important programmes for the climate on the BBC World Service is The Climate Question. It's right there in the name. And The Climate Question is the latest example of a radio programme going visual in search of new listeners, with each episode also having a visualised version on YouTube. The first visualised programme was on the Amazon and why it matters to our planet. Here are some comments from YouTube.
From Susie-Z4X.
I really enjoyed this. Grey-haired, the interviewer, was excellent. Easy to listen to, with an interesting and informed style of interviewing. I learned a lot about the Amazon's wildlife and how the forest is being affected by climate change.
At Fernando Salvador 2941. Interesting interview. I believe we're living in the tipping point.
I enjoyed this interview, and it makes me think of how fast we're devastating our most precious nature at an alarming rate. We should have done more to stop it, but we tended to ignore the impact of deforestation on Earth.
I sat down with BBC World Service digital editor Anna Doble. Anna, lovely to have you on the programme. Why did The Climate Question go visual?
We know that via YouTube and other social platforms and website routes, we can get a different audience to the one that maybe listens to the radio or has the World Service on a podcast feed. So especially with YouTube, we've found that creating visual versions of audio, so in-studio visuals, has been helpful in reaching new, younger audiences and international audiences around the world. The first visual version of The Climate Question, which is called Why the Amazon Matters, which went out 3 weeks ago, has a top audience in Bangladesh. And the others in the top 5 are Vietnam, Japan, India and South Korea. So I find that fascinating that for a topic about the Amazon, we've got an extremely youthful and Asian audience.
What are you able to now do with that new data showing where the audience is?
Well, we can commission based on the things we can see that have previously engaged people. So using that kind of data, we can decide to, say, do a question and answer session about a particular topic, bring in some of our climate experts here at BBC News, get the right scientists in, maybe zoom in on a country that we haven't done enough on, based on the fact that, say, well, Bangladesh, we've got a huge and very kind of engaged audience there.
And I suppose also, as well as seeing the location, you can see the gender split and also the age.
Yeah, and of course, you know, it's no surprise to you, Qasa, that we want younger audiences. We want to ensure that the World Service continues to have an audience in the future. And by being out there on platforms like YouTube or Instagram, we can make sure we are known for things beyond the day-to-day news. So for exploring bigger topics, but I guess having a hopefully optimistic tone with our coverage of big events.
So how are the audience feeling right now when it comes to news stories around the climate?
It is a tough sell. climate content, and it's never been a topic that you'll get reaction to. You can kind of struggle to engage. I'm talking about, Facebook and X and the traditional social platforms. I think if you can find a sort of more personal touch, so it's that kind of that gives you an audience. I think if you can find optimism and human personality, you can find a way of telling a story. It's hard to sort of get people to be interested in COP itself because it's lots and lots of people in suits gathering in a room to discuss, basically policy. So it's a hard sell.
And what would you say has not worked so far, not necessarily just for the BBC, but in general, when it comes to climate stories and getting that breakthrough into audiences and into their consciousness?
Anything that is a bit, moving towards, I guess, scaring people about the climate is a bad idea. We've got to be honest that the situation facing the planet is a concern. But writing headlines such as, and I'm not going to say what this was for, but I was once in a meeting about a piece of content, and the headline was at one point, 2 years to save the planet. So we decided against that title, even though it had a lot of, grabbiness to it. How to save the broken planet. These kinds of titles you see a lot around the climate debate. And by overly pointing out the sort of desperateness of the situation, you actually disengage people. So while remaining honest and truthful about what needs to happen, you also need to break it down and show people that even now, in 2025, we can, if we work together, create new targets and new ways of mitigating the problem and turning some of the tides back and making sure that coastal populations, island populations, people living in remote places that will be affected first are actually going to be helped, and that there is a positive message to share and a hopeful message to share as well.
Thank you for your time, Anna.
Thanks, Qasa.
Now, there can be too much doom and gloom when covering the warming planet, so the people trying to be optimistic and find solutions are regularly featured on People Fixing the World. On a recent edition, producer Richard Kenny compared projects in Germany and Singapore which are using wind to cool overheating cities.
Welcome to Stuttgart in the southwest of Germany. It's home to some 5 million people in the metropolitan area, and it's a big industrial city.
In the night, you get not under 25 degrees. It's horrible to get a good night. If you have 1 week with 35, 36 degrees, that's a health problem for all, especially for older people.
And the solution is right here. I'm standing in a wind corridor, or to give it its proper German name, Frischluftschneise, fresh air corridor. It's simply
And here in the studio with us is Richard Kenny, the reporter and producer on the episode. Richard, how did the idea for this episode come about?
I was really keen to do an episode about the urban heat island effect. That's when the cities get really hot, particularly in the summer, because of all the buildings, because of all the cars, and it's only getting worse because of climate change. And I was looking around for some interesting solutions that were out there, and I came across this example in Stuttgart, where they were using something that's free, something that's all around us, the wind, to keep the cities cool.
And you've chosen two places, yes, as you said there, Stuttgart, one of them, in Western Europe, and also Singapore, which is in Asia. So two very different places in the world with different climates. But what did you find from those two areas?
Yeah, very different. I mean, in some ways, they're both suffering from heat and pollution, like many cities around the world. Stuttgart is surrounded by hills and doesn't get much wind. The solution there was a slightly unusual one for People Fixing the World. It's a sort of not a high-tech solution. It's basically using the wind that is all around us. It's free, it's there, and just being able to direct it so it provides a little bit of refreshing air. Their study of how you look at the urban climate has inspired a lot of other cities around the world. So somewhere like Singapore, with a lot of skyscrapers, they effectively block the wind. They've looked at what they've done in Stuttgart and tried to encourage passages of wind through the city.
And clearly, it's all about people as well. Do you think that is quite important for people to take away, how important it is for those who are there to own it and take charge?
Definitely. I mean, and that's a lot of what we try and do on People Fixing the World is the effects that these solutions have on real people and trying to talk about the people that the problem affects and meet the people who are trying to make the difference. I met a lovely English teacher called Manfred and Norbert and Heike up in the green spaces around Stuttgart. They're all people who are trying to preserve this wind and the cool air, and they know about it and they care about it. And they're trying to make sure that, that the city planners do the right thing as well, and they don't build in the wrong place. And they all of them in their own way have campaigned to preserve areas, and they're still talking. They talk to me about how they're worried about some developments that are happening now, and that it might stop the wind and make it a hotter, less pleasant place to be. But they are concerned citizens, and that's what we're all about on People Fixing the World.
And when it comes to the audience, I mean, People Fixing the World often focuses on those high-tech solutions and how we need to look to the future to solve issues, not just here for the climate. However, what did you want the audience to take away when you're looking at something that is as plentiful and all around us as wind?
So often the solutions are simple. They're not always high-tech, that they're all around us, but we've got to just be aware of them and notice them and realise what's going on. Yeah, I mean, People Fix the World, we are all about solutions. We are the sort of antidote to what else is going on in the news. And you do want people to be uplifted and given a sense of hope and agency that they can do something.
How does solutions journalism help with people day to day?
It is about changing the balance, I suppose, in what we hear on the radio and the news, because there's so many people doing good things out there and we don't hear about them that often, because quite often what they're doing is sort of in the background. Sometimes it's quite boring. We want people to feel, I suppose, that there's a lot of people out there making a difference to the world. And I think if you listen to the news, most of the news bulletins, you might not come away with that feeling. You might come away a little bit depressed that there's so many people not doing good things. But in fact, the reality is there's loads of people doing fantastic work and at least trying, not always succeeding, but at least trying to make the world a better place. And that's what we want to get over, is that's the real world. More people doing good things than bad things.
Richard Kenny, thank you. Well, that's it for this month's Over to You. You, the listener, are the most important part of this programme, and I want to hear what you think about anything you're hearing on the BBC World Service. Positive or negative? You can let us know by emailing us on overtoyou@bbc.co.uk or leaving us a message on +44 1449 609 000. Next month, I'll be sitting down to put your questions to John Zilker, the controller of BBC World Service English, in our annual interview. So please get in touch if there's anything you'd like to ask him. I'm Qasa Alom, and the producer is Jill Achineku. Thank you for listening, and see you next month.